4.1 Ethical and Legal Issues in Sport and Exercise Science Research. So in terms of the history of sport and exercise science research, using human subjects for research experiments really kicked off in World War II, when the Nazis began using their prisoners as human guinea pigs to conduct their experiments. These prisoners were given the name subjects due to the fact that they were subjected to experimentation, meaning that it was not a voluntary thing and they were actually forced to take part against their will. Many of the subjects were pushed well past their limits in order for the Nazi researchers to gain knowledge that could help them gain the edge in the war. Many ended up with permanent physical impairments, emotional and psychological damage, and many would have lost their lives. Some of the experiments conducted were attitude tests, seeing how the body would react to certain attitudes that the Nazi soldiers may have to face during the war, and from that they could work out ways to overcome the effects of the attitude. Similarly, they also subjected many prisoners to freezing cold water temperatures to replicate the conditions Nazi pilots might face should they crash and end up in the sea. Of course, this would seem completely out of order to us now, but back then there was no one to say what a researcher could and couldn't do. Essentially it was murder and kind of manslaughter what was happening, but then it was just scientific research to them and they had no reason to think about ethics or morals. Following the end of the Second World War in 1947, the Nuremberg Code was devised as a result of the Nuremberg trials. During this, 23 Nazi physicians were tried and prosecuted for their unethical approach to human research. The Nuremberg Code was composed of 10 different points that researchers need to consider when using human participants for research purposes. The points included range from ensuring that there's informed consent, the participant having the right to withdraw, to ensuring that the benefits of the experiment outweigh the risks posed on the participants. Following the Nuremberg Code was the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which was produced by the World Medical Association. It's essentially a set of ethical principles all researchers must abide by, although it's not a legally binding document. There were two very controversial researchers, Zimbardo and Milgram. Milgram conducted an experiment whereby he wanted to see how people reacted to authority. To do this, he had a group of people and split them in two. One group were the teachers and the other were the learners. They then had an authority figure telling the teachers to administer ever-increasing electric shocks until fatal levels every time the learner provided a wrong answer. No electric shocks were actually administered, but those in the teacher role were unaware of that. In the Zimbardo's prison experiment, that was even more controversial, whereby he took 24 volunteers to fill the roles of prisoners and guards. The guards were told to be guards and to act as though that's what they were really doing. They weren't given limits and they were allowed to do whatever they wanted to the prisoners. The guards really took on the role of authority, putting the prisoners through physical, psychological and social trauma. Some even had to drop out. We've now got BTEC, which is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences. They're responsible for producing a code of conduct for sports science practitioners and researchers, which outlines ethical and legal issues that may arise with human research. BTEC is also a place to find recognised researchers who have earned their accreditation by carrying out previous research in the correct manner. So that's like abiding by the legal and ethical principles associated with human research. There are two types of issues that are most important with research methods within sports science. That's legal and ethical. So ethics are morals or principles that govern a person's behaviour or the conducting of an activity. They're essentially just what is right and wrong, and good ethics and morals should mean that no physical or emotional harm is done, whereas legal issues revolve working within the boundaries of the law. So informed consent is about making sure that the person knows exactly what's going to be happening during the experiment, and then them saying that they're happy to do that. However, for vulnerable groups such as younger people, those with learning difficulties and other disabilities, they usually need someone who's can give informed consent on their behalf, as they may not take into account all the things that will be going on and will be unaware as how it might affect them. The right to withdraw is quite self-explanatory, just that the person should be able to withdraw at any point in it, before, during or after the experiment. Even if it's just before the results are to be published or analysed, they can still withdraw at that point. they should all be volunteers, so they should not be coerced into doing it at any point or bribed with any kind of money or anything like that. Confidentiality and anonymity is basically that all of their personal details and stuff should be kept private, and from that they should be under the Data Protection Act of 1998, so that's just ensuring that none of their information is shared with other people so that harm could be done to them. The competence of the researcher, so they need to have the qualifications and experience to know what they're doing and not just be blagging it as they go, because that could result in some harm to coming to the participants. Professional conduct and responsibility, so that's just more or less the way the researcher acts towards the participants, like acting in a professional manner and not putting them down in any way. Deception, so deception can technically be used to an extent in the research. However, if deception is used, participants need to be debriefed as soon as possible. And there are two types of deception: omission and commission. So omission is where they might just leave something out and not mention it at all, whereas commission is where they'll actively lie to you and give you false information. Participant screening is also important, so that would be things such as PARQ, making sure that the participant is healthy and in the right state of mind to be doing the test in the first place. Not breaking any laws is quite self-explanatory. You need to work within the boundaries of civil law, as anyone else just in general has to do. Health and safety is just obviously, once a participant screening is done, you have to take into consideration any health and medical issues you might already have, as well as any health and safety aspects that could arise from the actual experiment taking place. It's important to make sure that they analyse the risks and benefits, making sure that the benefits of the actual experiment outweigh the risks that are being posed onto the participant, because otherwise it's not deemed as being worth it, really. And no scientific misconduct, so that's just basically just doing what you're meant to be doing as a scientific researcher and not overstepping boundaries. So of course, if any of these things are broken, there'll be consequences to both the researcher and the participants. So the participants could experience physical, emotional, and just physical harm and emotional harm, which can last a few days and it can be quite mild, or it could last for years and leave someone traumatized and like potentially ruin like their lives, really. So for the researcher, it can, like, the issues that have aroused could be solved with something as simple as ethical training. So just reiterating the fact that they must be ethical within their research and going over key points that could help them for future research they do. If they break any civil laws, then they could face prison sentences. If it's bad enough, they could be reprimanded or suspended from their jobs. And then from that, their professional or research credibility will likely be lost, and they probably won't have the chance to research again and won't be given many job opportunities, so they've kind of ruined their entire career. Fines can be put in place if someone is sued, or any compensation is needed to go towards the participant for any damage that has been done. And they could lose their basis accreditation, which is obviously a very big thing in terms of the researchers, because they have to work very hard to get that, so to lose it kind of speak for itself. So for scenario 1, we have an experiment to see how the duration of ice baths affects the rate of muscle recovery of 14 to 18-year-old female gymnastics after a maximal intensity training session. The participants are able to withdraw at any point if they begin to feel uncomfortable for any reason. The experiment is open to any willing female gymnast between the ages of 14 to 18 who wish to aid in the research of recovery aids. So the good points in this scenario is the fact that they have outlined the fact that they have the right to withdraw at any point they want to. And they've also meant that it's open to any willing female gymnastics, meaning that it's voluntary and that they haven't been coerced and no one will be forced into it. However, there is some deception in this, which is bad, but it's deception by omission. They haven't stated how long the ice baths will be, and obviously that could be quite uncomfortable for people. They might not be aware of how long they're meant to be in it. They might think it's going to be like a 30-second ice bath, and they could be left in there for a lot longer. And obviously that could actually cause some physical harm, as well as some potential emotional harm, because some people have like a fear of like cold water and things like that. They also haven't stated that they'll be doing a patient screening beforehand. So obviously if anyone had a condition such as asthma, which is often affected by a cold, that could lead to like their asthma being triggered essentially, and they could be in a lot of physical pain, and that could potentially be fatal if it was bad enough. So from that they could be sued, they could lose their jobs, and then potentially if someone were to have any fatal incidents due to the fact there was a lack of patient screening, a prison sentence could actually be put in place. And in terms of the deception, again, they could be sued because it could have caused the emotional trauma to the participant. They'd most likely lose their credibility and have to attend some ethical training to correct their behaviour. So scenario 2, an experiment to see which types of stretching are most effective for increasing muscle pliability within female gymnastics under the age of 16. Due to the age of participants, consent will be needed from a parent or legal guardian. This experiment is compulsory for all young gymnastics in the squad, and the data gathered will be used for future comparisons of the repeated experiment and stored online for easy access by researchers. Results will be gathered and analysed by a BTEC accredited researcher. So the good things from this point is the fact that it's got informed consent, and they've mentioned that due to the fact that some will be under the age of 16, they will be taking informed consent from a parent or guardian, because they aren't legally able to provide informed consent themselves due to their young age. Also, the competence of the researcher is a good point. The fact that it's a BTEC accredited researcher indicates that they have experience and they've proved themselves to be suitable researcher that would usually, in the past anyway, do so by the ethical and legal laws, because if they hadn't, they would have lost their BTEC accreditation. So the bad points about this is the data protection, for one, the fact that they will be sharing the data and leaving it online for kind of anyone to access, really, and that can cause social and psychological harm to the person, because they might not feel comfortable with other people knowing certain stuff about them, and that could leave them feeling quite vulnerable and lacking confidence. So for that, the researcher would most likely have to attend some ethical training to correct that behaviour, and possible reprimand or suspension if that was deemed necessary. Also, the fact that they stated it was compulsory means it's not voluntary, and obviously some people might feel uncomfortable doing this experiment, and because of that they could suffer from psychological harm because they're being forced to do something they don't want to do, and they might also be put into physical harm because they might physically not be able to do it, but they're still being told that they have to. And there's also the chance of social harm too, because they're doing this with people watching them, something they feel uncomfortable doing in the first place, and there'll be people aware of what's going on, people who they might think are better than them, and it could hurt their confidence too. So scenario 3, an experiment to see whether there is a correlation between age and flexibility. This will be conducted on a range of young female gymnastics between the age of 10 and 16, and measurements and data will be collected by their gymnastics coach. The data collected will be stored on a password-protected document that is inaccessible to others. All participants will have to fill out a PARQ before the experiment to ensure they're healthy and don't have any medical issues or injuries that could be aggravated by the experiment. So the bad points of this is the fact that it's informed consent. They can't give informed consent because they're at the age of 10 to 16, which is considered a vulnerable age where they can't make that decision for themselves. The competence of the researcher, the data is being collected by the gymnastics coach as opposed to the actual scientific researcher, and obviously that means that there's they might do something wrong and they might not act professionally as they should as a researcher, so the scientific misconduct could be there. The good parts of this is the data protection, the fact that the data is stored with password protected documents to stop other people from getting their hands on it, and the participant screening to make sure that the person is healthy in the first place. So scenario 3, an experiment to see whether the gymnast's body fat percentage has any relation to their flexibility levels. Gymnasts willing to take part will have their body fat measured and then proceed to complete a number of stretches which will be described and explained to them before starting. The range of movement will be measured by the researcher. Once they have consented to taking part, they are not able to and the results of the experiment will be presented to the group at the end. So the good points of this is the fact that there's informed consent, because everything has been explained to them, such as the stretches that they'll be taking part in beforehand, so they're given the information of what's actually going to be happening throughout the experiment. The fact that it's voluntary, so only the willing participants will have to do it, and the competence of the researcher, being that the fact the researcher will be measuring the range of movement and that. The bad points, however, is the fact of the right to withdraw. That's not present. So, for instance, if someone was trying to do it and they started struggling, it could potentially cause physical harm if they're not actually able to do it and they want to stop because of physical reasons, but they're not being allowed to. And then there's the psychological and social harm. It could kind of like put them off doing the sport because they've had a bad experience for it, and they're put in an uncomfortable situation. And the fact that it's in front of other people could provide social harm. So then the researcher could likely be sued, and they probably won't get a job again in researching because of the way they've treated previous participants. There's a potential for a prison sentence if they actually cause physical harm to, these will be classed as minors, as a lot of them will be underage. They will most likely have to use some ethical training as well if they ever want to be in the researching kind of industry again. The data protection is also a negative aspect here, as they said that they will be sharing and presenting the results to the entire group at the end. That could cause social and psychological harm, especially with the fact that they're measuring body fat as well. That's quite a sensitive subject for young girls in the first place. And so if they're presenting everyone's results to an entire group of people, that could provide some social and psychological harm to the participant. And because of that, they'd probably have to go through some ethical training. They'd most likely lose their accreditation, and they might be reprimanded or suspended for what they've done.